Welcome back, guys. We're continuing on with a short discussion about Paul Gauguin and the role that he played in Vincent van Gogh's life and what ultimately brought the end of the painter to bear. The work that's in the image set for him is the large allegorical work. Who are we? Where do we come from? And where are we going? So I'm giving you some examples there on the side of videos that'll be helpful for post-impressionism and understanding who Gauguin actually is. So let me get rid of my face here and we'll get the PowerPoint lined up here ready to go. A couple of things that you need to know about this painter, guys. Both he and Van Gogh, they're outside painters. They're outsiders who come to art late. They're not painting in the academic system, and their art has a bold kind of perspective, kind of being outside the norm of what people expect to see hanging in the galleries and salons. Originally, Gauguin did this as entertainment on the side, but decided to become a full-fledged painter when he went through a stock market crisis as a stockbroker and lost a lot of his worth and value financially. He left his wife and kids and basically decided to travel around looking for places and ways that he as a painter could reconnect to nature and kind of the unspoiled life that wouldn't have been touched by the industrial world that he was pretty much a big part of already. This painting by Paul Gauguin is an early work where he kind of left Paris and goes to the north of Brittany. Brittany is a part of France that's fairly rural and provincial and known for the intense religiosity that the people in the region profess and follow. They have their own period costumes and their own traditions in terms of the calendar for worship. And they provide a lot of subject matter for Gauguin early in his life as he tries to kind of find what subject matter sums up, which culture has the most authority to speak about an unspoiled world. This little image here basically is a pretty big one in his body of work because it's one that is celebrated back in Paris once it's painted and delivered there. What you're seeing is a sermon. The Vision After the Sermon is the title, and what you're seeing are these Breton women who are having a collective vision in the field on their way back from having heard a particularly fervent sermon. The field of green has turned red, and across from their view, just out on the other side of the canvas, which is divided by that tree, we see Jacob battling with the angel. And it's a scene that you'll probably recognize from the Vienna Genesis. One of the pages of the folios of the Codex features the exact same scene where Jacob fights to get an angel's blessing. His hip is put out of joint. Eventually, the two get together and it's fine. But ultimately, this vision has been brought on by a relatively powerful sermon. Now, guys, right off the bat, in post-impressionism, I want you to remember that these guys don't depict the world the way the Impressionists did, who were so taken up by catching the momentary or transient effects of light on surface. This is visionary, and it's specific to the artist, almost elevating him to the status of genius, so that what his view is the way that we should really be seeing the world around us. So this is artwork that is populated by a very thick, heavy contour line. It's really obvious in the white that you see around the headdresses of the Breton women. It's also going to be obvious in the lines of the tree that kind of divide this whole thing up, and you even see lines in the angel's wings. So that is one of the visual characteristics that's synonymous with his style, really dark contour lines. Flat fields of color are also synonymous with Gauguin in the way that we see the field that he's painted. It is just simply a flat field of red. We see some modulations and colorings that kind of suggest grass or growth on the ground, but the idea is that these are purposefully dissynchronous to kind of energize and electrify the imagery that we see. This particular work he was incredibly fond of. The Breton women that we realized from the previous painting are now praying and meditating in the field, and that meditation has conjured up a figure of this green, putrid-looking Christ on a crucifix, a visionary detail that's kind of referenced in the landscape. He thought so highly of this work that he included a self-portrait of himself at that time, with ceramics that were by his hand in the background, as well as the infamous green Christ. These images that you're looking at are going to be like forerunners to Expressionism. When we talk about that in the 20th century, we will come back to the works of Van Gogh and Gauguin as basically expressing the truth that's underneath the layer of the world that we see. So these guys are reinterpreting color and the role that it will play as kind of like a design element, giving it over to it, if you will, and letting it kind of run its course all over the canvas. So here is a portrait of Vincent painting his ever famous sunflowers in the short time that they were together in Arles. These two accepted challenges from one another to render each other in their respective styles. So here in the Van Gogh, we see him kind of obsessed with his sunflowers. His jacket is delineated with a harsh line in blue. The features are also delineated, and we have those flat fields of color that seem to kind of suggest a more primitive kind of artwork. Something that's basically unclassical or anti-classical, and something that's really quite tied to primitive outlook. Of course, with Van Gogh's ear incident, we see Gauguin leave, and he goes looking for a paradise and finds one in Tahiti. Unfortunately, though, when he arrives, he realizes that he's arrived a little bit too late. This is not as unspoiled as the imagery would suggest, because the French have begun to industrialize and harvest the land's natural resources. So he continually has to go in pursuit of something that's more raw and more unindustrialized. And he gets quite frustrated in the process. But from his exposure to Tahiti and the cycle of life there, that Tahitian imagery kind of populates the rest of his body of work. Here we see a female holding a gourd, and around her are other females in repose. In the far distance, we see a mother and child, and it seems to kind of to connote a Garden of Eden, or a time where man is unified with nature. And nature is vibrant with lines of color that delineate foreground and background and figure. And we see the color palette is like acid greens and yellows and peaches and pastels. So color, again, electrifies the scene and makes it seem like this is totally alive. That kind of influence, guys, influences him to retell the story of the West using these images from the Far East. La Orana Maria, the title of it, references Mary and the Christ child, and we see these little halos right here around their faces as they are venerated by other Tahitians. So you can see Gauguin has kind of wrapped himself around this Tahitian experience, and he's using it now to kind of tell the story, the epic stories that have a more Western kind of bent in a different kind of way. You can see here again, we have the similar kinds of flat fields of color. This shouldn't be overlooked, guys. This is like a definition of the picture plane. We have figures that look somewhat dimensional, but their bodies are indicated with simple brush strokes and contour lines. And the land around them is getting flatter and flatter and flatter to the point that it really becomes just a study or composition. If you look at this piece right here, the lake behind the females in the foreground, it's just a whole kind of series of flat fields of color that are kind of allowed a life of their own. what we should be seeing as blue water is electrified and made to look a little bit more alluring. So this outsider art is going to have a strong impact on the expressionism moving forward. And some of these works, I have to tell you, have a darker side to Gauguin. And many of you probably will know he left his wife, left his kids, and took up a wife in his new homeland. She was very young, and she becomes the subject of many of his paintings. There's just kind of a weird, strange, foreboding feel about this nude who's exposing her backside to us while a figure of some kind of Pacific god looks over her menacingly. This piece shows up in a self-portrait from the time period late in his life. You can see it there in the background, and it kind of reflects his willingness to engage that Tahitian mindset. He's no longer a European and wants you to make note of it. You can see back here the Pacific god who's looking out over the scene. The tone changes toward the end of his life with failing health. He decides it's time to commit suicide, and decides that this work will stand in for his outlook and for the rest of his body of work. He basically creates what I think of as a Tahitian triptych, a religious piece, if you will, that uses Tahitian imagery to probe the big questions. Where do we come from? What are we? And where are we going? This is the work from 1897 toward the end of the career. Now, looking at the whole thing, I want you guys to remember, you probably need to read this thing from right to left. You also need to see it as kind of a worship piece. The background is kind of emphasized in gold, the way that you would practically see any kind of triptych or polyptych used for an altarpiece in a religious setting. This kind of idea or foray examines these Tahitian figures as symbols for the beginning, the middle, and the end of life in much the same way that French symbolists were doing, using classical figures to pose the big questions of life. Really, artists at this time are looking for universal symbolism that basically will speak to anyone regardless of where they come from in the world. And Gauguin, has basically figured out that Tahiti seems to garner bragging rights here on that one. What he's done is he's used typical imagery from all of his panels and portraits and put them in to stand in for him as an allegory of both his work and his life. So we can read his own writing about the piece and talk a little bit more afterwards about the content or imagery that we see. It says, in a letter to his friend Charles Morris, Gauguin shed light on the meaning of this painting. Where are we going? Near to death, an old woman. What are we? Day-to-day existence. Where do we come from? Source, child, life begins. Behind a tree, two sinister figures, cloaked in garments of somber color, introduce near the tree of knowledge their note of anguish, caused by that very knowledge in contrast to some simple beings in a virgin nature, which might be paradise as conceived by humanity, who gives themselves up to the happiness of living. Where do we come from is therefore a sobering, pessimistic image of the life cycle's inevitability. Gauguin's attempt to commit suicide in Tahiti was unsuccessful, but he died a few years later in 1903 in the Marquesas, his artistic genius still unrecognized. If we take a look closer at the content, guys, and we start, as I said, from the right to the left, this detail goes to about the middle of the painting. You can see this cycle starts with that young child there who's just been born, is being introduced to the life that he'll have on this earth. As you see in the background there, it is like a maze of flat fields of color that overlap and bump into one another, but it represents kind of the free-form world of paradise that moves around us as we grow and become adults here, represented by the figure who's reaching up to grab the fruit and live his day-to-day existence. When you move across the panel, you see there in the background an allusion to Pacific gods. Figures wander around. This lady here moves aimlessly, trying to find her direction and way forward. As people kind of feed themselves and nurture themselves, and then we get to the point of the end of time and end of life. Basically, all around the figures, we have a Garden of Eden kind of scenario, but the colors are allowed to wander freely. And we have images of birds here used to tell the story of life. This one colorful, this one white. Gauguin wrote about that white bird standing in for language and communication. So you can see that he's trying to investigate all of these as whether or not they will serve as symbols for greater ideas, bigger philosophical ideas. And that is what makes him a symbolist. Universal symbols of grief or suffering, like the woman that sits there with her face in her hands, basically connotes those images of sadness and depression that we all can notice, whether we're looking at Rodin's The Thinker or if we're looking at something that's classical. These are images that are synonymous with the life cycles. So the beginning of life, the highlight, the middle of life, and then the end of life are all addressed here by the artist. I will say this, guys, the title is in the back, written in Gauguin's handwriting. So this imagery does combine a little bit of text and may give you an opportunity to write about Gauguin on the exam. So we will pause here since the next slide is about Seurat, who's not on the exam. I'll let you get a snack, come back, and we'll continue on with Edvard Munch.